The moment he saw the boy's eyes, the room seemed to forget how to breathe. Ethan Caldwell stepped out of the elevator into the quiet, polished lobby of St. Mark's Private Medical Center, the kind of place where everything whispered money without ever raising its voice, where marble floors reflected soft gold lighting, and even footsteps felt controlled, measured, intentional. And yet something in the air shifted the second he crossed the threshold. Something subtle but sharp enough to press against his chest like a memory trying to surface. He wasn't here for anything personal, just a quick visit to finalize a corporate donation with the hospital board. Another line in a schedule packed so tight it barely left space for thought. But then he saw her, seated alone near the far wall beneath a tall window where late afternoon light spilled in cool and pale. A woman dressed simply in a dark coat, her posture straight, her hands resting quietly in her lap, as if she had mastered the art of stillness. And even from a distance, there was something about her that disrupted the rhythm of his day. Not loud, not dramatic, just present in a way that refused to be ignored. Amara Brooks didn't look up when he entered, didn't shift or react or acknowledge the world moving around her. But something in Ethan's chest tightened, as if his body recognized what his mind had not yet caught up to, and he slowed without realizing it. His polished shoes soft against the marble as his gaze lingered longer than it should have, searching for a reason, for a name, for a place to file the familiarity that didn't make sense. He had built his life on precision, on knowing exactly where everything belonged, every deal, every person, every decision categorized and controlled. But this quiet woman sitting in the corner of a hospital lobby did not fit anywhere, and that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He told himself to keep walking, to stay focused, to move past it like any other passing detail. But then a small movement broke the stillness, a child stepping into the edge of his vision, and without meaning to, Ethan stopped. The boy couldn't have been more than 4, maybe 5, small. Enough that his hand fit easily into Amara's, his sneakers softly tapping against the floor as he shifted his weight, glancing around with the kind of quiet curiosity children carry when they've learned not to make noise in serious places. And there was nothing unusual about him at first glance. Just another kid waiting in a hospital lobby. Except Ethan couldn't look away. It started with something subtle, a tilt of the head. The way the boy's brow pulled together slightly as he studied a passing nurse, a tiny expression, almost nothing. But it hit Ethan like a misplaced note in a song he knew too well. And then came the eyes, dark but sharp, framed by lashes that shouldn't have felt familiar and yet did. And suddenly the space around him narrowed, the soft hum of distant conversations fading into something distant and hollow, as if the world had taken a step back to watch. The boy turned slightly, just enough for the light to catch his face. And that was when it happened, that impossible, undeniable recognition that didn't ask for permission before settling in Ethan's chest, heavy and uninvited. Because it wasn't just resemblance, it wasn't coincidence, it was precision, like someone had taken pieces of his own reflection and placed them carefully into a smaller, quieter version standing 10 feet away. Ethan's breath slowed without him noticing, his mind scrambling for logic, for timelines, for any explanation that could make this make sense, but none came, only the growing awareness that something long buried was pressing its way back to the surface. Amara finally moved, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a small shift as she reached down to adjust the boy's jacket, her movements calm, practiced, protective, and when she lifted her gaze, it didn't land on Ethan immediately, as if she had already felt his presence long before she chose to acknowledge it. And when their eyes finally met, there was no surprise in hers, no confusion, only a steady, unreadable calm that told him everything and nothing at the same time. Ethan took a step closer before he realized he was moving, drawn by something he couldn't name, something stronger than logic, stronger than control. And the closer he got, the clearer it became, every detail aligning in a way that made denial impossible. The curve of the boy's cheek, the shape of his mouth, the quiet intensity in his expression, it all echoed something Ethan knew too well, something he had spent years not thinking about. "Mom," the boy said softly, tugging at Amara's hand, his voice small but clear, and the word landed in Ethan's chest with more weight than it should have, because it connected them, defined them. placed Amara not as a stranger, but as something far more complicated, something tied to a part of his past he hadn't revisited in years. Ethan stopped just a few feet away now, close enough to see the fine details, close enough that the truth felt like it was standing right in front of him waiting to be spoken, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't know what to do with the silence. Amara didn't speak, didn't offer explanation or greeting. She simply looked at him with that same steady gaze, her expression controlled, composed, as if she had already walked through this moment 1,000 times in her mind and found no reason to rush it. Ethan's voice, when it finally came, was lower than usual, stripped of the usual certainty that defined him. Because this wasn't a boardroom. This wasn't a negotiation he could dominate. This was something else entirely, something personal, something real, and he could feel it slipping beyond his control with every passing second. He looked at the boy again, then back at her, the question forming before he could stop it, before he could filter it through logic or strategy, because some truths don't wait for permission, they demand to be spoken. "Tell me the truth," he said, his voice quiet but firm, the words hanging between them like something fragile and dangerous at the same time. "Is he mine?" And the world seemed to hold its breath again, the distant sounds of the hospital fading into nothing as the weight of that question settled in the space between them. Amara didn't react immediately, didn't rush to answer or defend or explain. She simply looked at him, her expression unchanged, her silence stretching just long enough to make Ethan feel it, to make him understand that whatever came next would not belong to him to control. And for the first time in years, Ethan Caldwell stood there, waiting, not commanding, not deciding, just waiting, as if everything he had built, everything he believed about power and certainty, had suddenly been reduced to a single moment he could not predict, and somewhere deep inside him, beneath the logic and the control, something unfamiliar began to rise, something that felt dangerously close to fear. Amara let the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of his question to settle where it belonged, not in the air, but inside him, and when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, even, untouched by the tension that had tightened his chest, and she said only one word, "Yes." And it did not come with hesitation or softness or explanation. It landed clean and final, like something that had been decided long before this moment ever arrived. Ethan did not move, not at first, because the word did not echo, it absorbed, sinking into him in a way that left no space for denial. And for a second, he simply looked at the boy again, at Noah, as if seeing him clearly for the first time now that the truth had been spoken aloud, and the resemblance that had already unsettled him moments ago now sharpened into something undeniable, something permanent, something that could not be walked away from or rewritten. His mind reached instinctively for structure, for timelines, for the version of reality that made sense. But the numbers did not come easily, not when memory started pushing through the surface in fragments he had not revisited in years, a night he had dismissed as temporary, a connection he had not considered lasting, a decision made quickly, efficiently, like everything else in his life back then, and suddenly that version of himself felt distant, almost unfamiliar, as if he were looking at the outline of a man who had not understood the weight of what he was leaving behind. "How long?" he asked, his voice lower now, not sharp, not demanding, but controlled in a way that felt different, like he was trying to hold something steady inside himself that no longer wanted to stay still. And Amara's gaze did not shift, did not soften. She simply answered, "He is 4. And that number hit harder than anything else because it carried time with it. Years that had passed without his knowledge, moments he had not been part of, first words, first steps, quiet nights and long mornings that had happened without him even knowing they existed. And for the first time the absence was not abstract. It was specific. Ethan exhaled slowly, his hand brushing against the side of his coat as if grounding himself in something familiar. But there was no familiar place to stand in this conversation, no position that gave him control, and that realization settled in with a quiet pressure that he could not ignore. Noah shifted slightly beside Amara, his small fingers tightening around hers, his gaze moving between them with a quiet awareness that felt older than his years, and Ethan noticed it. The way the boy did not interrupt, did not ask questions, as if he had learned early that some moments required silence, and that detail alone said more than anything Amara had spoken. "Why did you not tell me?" Ethan asked, and this time there was something beneath the words, not accusation, not exactly, but something closer to confusion, to a question he did not know how to frame differently. And Amara finally looked away from him for a brief second, her eyes dropping to Noah, her thumb brushing lightly over the back of his hand in a small, grounding gesture, before she looked back at Ethan and answered with the same steady calm. "You were not looking." And the simplicity of it cut deeper than any explanation could have, because it did not accuse, it did not justify, it simply stated what had been true at the time, and Ethan felt it, the quiet accuracy of that statement pressing against every version of his past he had accepted without question. He opened his mouth as if to respond, to correct, to offer some version of events that aligned with the man he believed himself to be, but nothing came, because he could not deny it, not honestly, not in a way that would hold under the weight of this moment, and that realization left him standing there in a silence that felt different from before, less controlled, more exposed. "I would have taken responsibility," he said finally, the words measured, chosen carefully, and Amara's expression did not change, but there was a slight shift in her gaze, something almost unreadable passing through it before she replied. "Responsibility is not the same as presence." And that landed just as cleanly as her first answer, stripping the conversation down to something more fundamental, something he could not argue his way around. Ethan glanced at Noah again, watching the way the boy leaned slightly into Amara's side, not out of fear, but out of familiarity, of belonging, and that small movement told him everything about where the child's world had been built, and who had built it. "I want to know him," Ethan said, and this time there was no edge of command in his voice, no expectation that the statement alone would shape the outcome. It was simply what it was, a request, and even that felt unfamiliar to him, and Amara did not answer immediately. She let the words sit there, examining them in the same quiet way she had held everything else in this moment, before she responded. "Wanting is easy." And then after a brief pause, she added, "He does not need easy." And there was no anger in her tone, no raised voice, just clarity, the kind that comes from years of living with a decision and understanding exactly why it was made. Ethan felt something shift again inside him, something that did not fit into the categories he was used to, not frustration, not irritation, something else, something heavier, and for a moment he did not speak, because there was nothing immediate he could say that would change what had already been established here. A nurse walked past in the background, the soft sound of her footsteps briefly returning the world to motion, but the space between them remained still, suspended in something that felt separate from everything else happening around them. "Does he know?" Ethan asked after a moment, and Amara's answer came just as simply. "He knows what he needs to know." And that answer, like the others, did not invite further questions. It closed them, set boundaries without needing to announce them. Noah looked up at Amara then, his voice quiet as he said, "Are we leaving?" And she nodded gently, her attention shifting fully to him for the first time since Ethan had approached. And in that shift there was something undeniable, something that made it clear where her priorities had always been and would remain. She stood, smooth and unhurried, adjusting Noah's jacket again before taking his hand. And Ethan felt the moment changing, slipping forward into something he was not ready to let end. Not yet. Not like this. "Amara," he said, and her name felt unfamiliar on his tongue, like something he should have said more often once but had not, and she paused, not turning fully, just enough to acknowledge that she had heard him, and he hesitated for a fraction of a second before continuing. "This is not over." And the statement came out instinctively, shaped by years of believing that situations could be extended, negotiated, controlled. But even as he said it, he knew it did not land the way it would have anywhere else. Amara turned slightly then, her expression calm, her eyes steady, and she said, "It was never yours to continue." And with that she guided Noah toward the exit, their steps quiet against the marble floor, and Ethan remained where he was, watching them move away, not because he did not know how to follow, but because for the first time in a very long time, he understood that moving forward would require something he had not yet learned how to give. The doors of the medical center slid open with a soft mechanical hum, and the cool evening air brushed against Amara's face as she stepped outside, her grip steady around Noah's small hand, her pace unhurried but intentional, as if she had walked away from moments like this before and knew exactly how to carry herself through them, while behind her, inside the polished stillness of the lobby, Ethan Caldwell remained rooted in place for a few seconds longer than he should have, his reflection faintly staring back at him from the glass walls, a version of himself that suddenly looked less certain than it had when he first walked in. He exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that did not release tension but only made him aware of how much of it he was holding. And then he moved, not with urgency, not with the sharp efficiency that usually defined him, but with something more measured, more deliberate, as he stepped outside into the fading light where the city felt louder, more real, less controlled. Amara was already halfway down the sidewalk, Noah at her side, their figures blending into the rhythm of people moving past them, but Ethan did not lose sight of them. Not now. Not when the distance between knowing and not knowing had finally been erased. He followed, keeping enough space to avoid turning the moment into a chase, because something in him understood that pushing too hard would only close doors he had just discovered existed. The sound of traffic filled the air, engines idling, distant horns echoing between buildings, and Noah looked up briefly at the passing cars, his curiosity quiet but present, and Ethan noticed even that, the way the boy absorbed the world without demanding attention from it, and it struck him again how much had been lived without him ever being part of it. Amara reached the curb and paused, pressing the crosswalk button with a calm, practiced motion, and Noah shifted closer to her side, his small fingers tightening just slightly, and Ethan slowed his steps, stopping a few feet behind them, close enough to hear the faint rhythm of their breathing, close enough that the moment felt immediate but not intrusive. The signal changed, and they stepped forward together, and Ethan followed, the city unfolding around them in layers of sound and motion that felt almost distant compared to the quiet intensity building inside him. On the other side of the street, Amara did not look back, did not acknowledge his presence, but she did not quicken her pace either, and that choice alone told him that she was aware of him, that she was allowing this moment to extend on her terms, not his. Noah glanced back once, his eyes landing on Ethan for just a second, not fearful, not confused, just curious in a way that made Ethan's chest tighten unexpectedly, because there was no recognition there yet, no understanding of what connected them. Only a quiet observation that felt too calm for a child his age, and Ethan held that look for a fraction of a second longer before Noah turned back toward Amara, his attention shifting as easily as it had come. "He does not know you," Amara said without turning, her voice steady, cutting through the ambient noise without needing to rise above it. And Ethan felt the truth in that statement settle in before he responded. "He will." And the words came out instinctively, shaped by a lifetime of believing that outcomes could be directed, that intentions could become reality simply by being pursued. But even as he said it, he heard the difference in his own voice, the absence of certainty that usually followed him like a shadow. Amara slowed her steps slightly, enough to acknowledge the statement without fully stopping, and she replied, "Knowing is not the same as belonging." And that distinction landed with a quiet precision that left no room for argument. Because it was not emotional, not defensive, it was simply true in a way that could not be negotiated. Ethan walked beside them now, not ahead, not leading, just present, and the unfamiliarity of that position settled into him with a subtle weight, because it required something he was not used to giving: patience without control, presence without authority. "I am not asking to take anything from him," Ethan said after a moment, his voice steady again but different, less guarded, more deliberate. And Amara finally stopped walking, turning just enough to face him fully, her expression composed, her eyes searching his in a way that felt less like judgment and more like evaluation, as if she were measuring something that had yet to prove itself. "You already did," she said, and the words did not come with anger. They came with clarity, and that made them heavier, because they did not accuse him of intention. They simply acknowledged impact, and Ethan felt that settle into a place he had not expected to feel exposed. Noah shifted slightly, looking up at Amara, then at Ethan again, his gaze thoughtful, and for a brief second, Something in that look felt like a question that had not yet formed into words, and Ethan noticed it, the awareness, the quiet intelligence, and it unsettled him in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with responsibility. "What is your name?" Ethan asked gently, lowering his voice slightly as he directed the question toward Noah, and Amara did not interrupt, did not stop him. She simply watched, and Noah hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "Noah." His voice soft but clear, and Ethan nodded slowly, repeating it under his breath as if grounding himself in something real, something tangible, something that existed beyond speculation and memory. "That is a strong name," Ethan said, and Noah gave a small nod, not quite smiling, but not withdrawing either. And that small exchange felt larger than it should have, because it was the first connection, however slight, between them, and Ethan recognized it for what it was, not progress, not acceptance. Just a beginning that had not been denied. Amara stepped forward. Again then, guiding Noah along the sidewalk, and Ethan followed once more, the distance between them no longer accidental but intentional, defined by boundaries that had been set without needing to be explained. The sky above them shifted toward evening, the light dimming into a softer gray that reflected off the glass buildings lining the street, and the city carried on around them, unaware of the quiet shift happening between three people moving through it, and Ethan felt it, the weight of something new, something unfamiliar, something that could not be solved with strategy or control. "I am not going anywhere," he said after a moment, not as a declaration of power, but as a statement of intent, and Amara did not stop this time, did not turn. She simply answered as she walked, "Then learn how to stay." And the words lingered in the space between them long after they were spoken, not as a challenge, not as a rejection, but as a condition, one that Ethan understood without needing further explanation, because for the first time in his life, staying would not mean holding on to something. It would mean becoming someone he had never needed to be before. The city lights came alive one by one, as the evening settled in, casting a soft glow over the sidewalks and glass buildings, and Ethan Caldwell stood still for a moment longer than necessary, watching the space where Amara and Noah had just turned the corner, their presence lingering in his mind in a way that refused to fade. And for the first time in years, he did not reach for his phone, did not check the time, did not redirect his attention back to the controlled rhythm of his schedule, because something inside him had shifted, beyond routine, beyond strategy, into something quieter and far less predictable. He eventually moved, but not toward his usual destination, not toward the waiting car that had already pulled up along the curb with a driver who expected efficiency and direction, but instead he walked the same path Amara had taken, his pace slower now, measured, as if each step required thought, and the unfamiliar weight of that realization followed him, the understanding that whatever came next would not be solved in a boardroom or outlined in a contract. It would have to be lived, one moment at a time. The street they had turned onto was calmer, lined with smaller storefronts and dimly lit apartment entrances, the kind of place that did not announce wealth but carried its own quiet stability. And Ethan noticed the details as he walked, the soft hum of a nearby cafe, the faint laughter from a group of people passing by, the ordinary rhythm of life that had existed entirely outside of his world. And for a brief moment, he realized how little he had ever paid attention to spaces like this, places where things were built slowly, consistently, without spectacle. Ahead, he saw them again. Amara unlocking the door to a modest brick building, Noah standing close beside her, his small hand still in hers, and Ethan slowed, stopping across the street this time, not wanting to cross a boundary that had already been clearly drawn, and he watched as she opened the door, guiding Noah inside before stepping in after him. And just before the door closed, she glanced back once, her eyes meeting his across the distance, not surprised, not unsettled, just aware, and then the door shut quietly behind her, leaving Ethan standing alone on the sidewalk with nothing but the echo of everything that had just changed. He remained there for a few seconds, longer than necessary, as if grounding himself in the reality of what he had just witnessed, and then he turned away, finally walking back toward his car, the familiar presence of it waiting where it always did, ready, predictable, controlled. But as he opened the door and stepped inside, the leather seat felt different, colder somehow, less like a place of authority and more like a space that no longer fit as easily as it once had. "Home, sir?" the driver asked, glancing at him briefly through the rearview mirror, and Ethan paused. The word home, settling differently than it usually did, because for the first time, it felt incomplete, disconnected from something he had just discovered, and after a moment he said, "Not yet," his voice steady but distant, and the driver nodded, waiting for further instruction that did not come immediately. Ethan leaned back slightly, his gaze fixed on the passing streetlights as the car pulled away from the curb, and his mind did not return to business, did not jump to meetings or numbers or decisions. It stayed where it had been left, replaying moments in a sequence that now carried weight he could not ignore. Amara's voice, calm and certain, Noah's eyes, steady and observant, the quiet way they moved through the world without needing anything from it, and the realization that he had been absent. From all of it settled in with a clarity that was impossible to dismiss. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out his phone, the familiar object feeling almost foreign in his hand as he unlocked it, his thumb hovering for a second before dialing a number he had not called in years, and when the line connected, the voice on the other end came through with professional ease. "Marcus speaking," and Ethan closed his eyes briefly before responding. "I need information," his tone controlled but different, lacking the usual detachment that came with requests like this, and Marcus paused for a fraction of a second, picking up on the shift even if he did not understand it yet. "Of course, sir, what kind of information?" And Ethan hesitated, not because he did not know what to ask, but because saying it out loud would make it fully real in a way that could not be undone. "Her name is Amara Brooks," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "And she has a son." And there was a slight silence on the other end before Marcus responded. "Understood. I will begin immediately." But Ethan's grip tightened slightly around the phone as he added, "No." And the word came sharper than he intended, not with anger, but with correction, with intention, and Marcus waited, listening carefully now. "Do not investigate her like a case." Ethan continued, choosing his words with precision. "I am not asking for leverage. I am asking for understanding." And the distinction hung there, unfamiliar but clear, and Marcus responded after a moment, "Yes, sir," his tone adjusting to match the seriousness of the request. Ethan ended the call and lowered the phone slowly, his reflection faint in the dark window beside him, and for the first time, he did not recognize the man looking back, not because he had changed entirely, but because something had shifted beneath the surface, something that could not be undone by ignoring it. The car moved through the city, past buildings he had helped finance, past spaces that carried his influence in ways he had always been proud of, but tonight they felt distant, less important, because there was something far more immediate waiting just a few blocks behind him. Something he could not buy, could not control, could not force into place. He leaned forward slightly, his voice calm as he addressed the driver again. "Turn around." And the driver complied without question, the car smoothly shifting direction as the city lights blurred past them in reverse, and Ethan felt something settle inside him. Not certainty, not yet, but intention, the kind that did not rely on outcome, but on action. When the car slowed near the brick building again, Ethan did not step out immediately. He remained seated, looking up at the windows, some lit, some dark, each one holding a life he did not know. And somewhere behind one of those windows, Amara and Noah were continuing their evening without him, just as they had every day before this. And that realization did not push him forward, it grounded him, reminding him that whatever place he might have in their lives would not be taken. It would have to be earned. He finally stepped out of the car, the night air cooler now, carrying the faint sounds of the neighborhood settling into its own rhythm, and he did not walk to the door, did not knock, did not interrupt. Instead, he stood there for a moment, just present, just aware, allowing himself to feel the distance, the boundary, the space that existed between who he had been and who he might need to become. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Caldwell understood that some things could not be rushed, some things required patience, consistency, and a kind of presence he had never had to learn before. And as he turned back toward the car, he knew that this was not a situation he could solve in a day, or a week, or even a month. It was something that would unfold over time, something that would demand more from him than anything else ever had. And as he stepped back inside the car, he did not feel in control, but he did feel something else, something quieter, something steadier, something that felt like the beginning of accountability. The night settled deeper over the city, and inside the quiet apartment on the third floor of the brick building, a soft yellow light glowed through partially drawn curtains, steady and warm, untouched by the tension that had followed Ethan outside, and within that space, Amara moved with the same calm rhythm she had carried all day, setting down her keys on a small wooden table by the door before helping Noah out of his jacket, her hands gentle but efficient, as if routine was something she relied on to keep the world stable no matter what tried to disrupt it. Noah slipped out of his shoes near the entryway, placing them neatly beside a pair of smaller sneakers already lined up, and he glanced up at her, his expression thoughtful, the kind of quiet curiosity that had begun earlier now settling into something more focused, something that needed answers, even if he did not yet know how to ask the right questions. Amara noticed it immediately. Of course she did, because she had learned to read every shift in him long before he had learned to explain himself, and she guided him gently toward the small living area, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder as they moved together. The apartment modest but carefully kept, every object placed with intention, every space carrying a sense of quiet ownership that did not rely on excess. "Do you want something to eat?" she asked softly, her voice even, offering normalcy before anything else, and Noah nodded slightly, though his gaze remained fixed on her, as if he was holding on to a question that had not yet found its way into words. She moved into the kitchen, pulling a small container from the refrigerator, setting it on the counter, the familiar motions grounding both of them, and as she worked, she felt the echo of the earlier moments still lingering beneath the surface, not disrupting her, not shaking her, but present in a way that could not be ignored. She had always known this day could come, not in detail, not in timing, but in possibility, because the past does not disappear simply because it is left behind. It waits, it reshapes itself, it finds its way back when the time is no longer avoidable. Noah climbed onto one of the chairs by the small dining table, his legs swinging slightly as he watched her, and after a few seconds, he spoke, his voice soft but clear. "Who was that man?" And the question landed without hesitation, without fear, just simple curiosity, and Amara paused for a brief moment, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the counter as she considered the answer, not because she did not know what to say, but because she understood that what she said now would shape something much larger than the moment itself. She turned to face him, her expression calm, her tone steady as she walked back toward the table, placing the plate in front of him before taking a seat across from him, bringing herself down to his level, not above him, not distant, just present. "That was someone from my past," she said, her words clear but measured, giving him truth without overwhelming him, and Noah tilted his head slightly, processing, his small fingers resting on the edge of the table as he thought. "Does he know me?" he asked next, and Amara held his gaze, not avoiding it, not softening it, just meeting him where he was. "He knows about you now," she answered, and Noah nodded slowly, absorbing that, his mind moving in quiet steps that did not rush ahead, but did not stay still either. "Is he coming back?" he asked after a moment, and there was no fear in the question, just a need to understand what might change, what might stay the same. And Amara reached across the table, her hand covering his gently, grounding him in the same way she always had. "That depends on him," she said, and her tone did not carry doubt or expectation. It carried truth, simple and steady, and Noah accepted it with a small nod, the kind of acceptance that came from trusting the person in front of him more than the uncertainty beyond it. Outside, the city continued to move, cars passing, lights shifting, and across the street, inside the parked car, Ethan sat quietly, his gaze still fixed on the building, though he could no longer see them. Only imagine the life continuing behind those walls, and for the first time, imagination did not feel like control, it felt like distance, like something he had to bridge slowly, carefully, without forcing it. His phone rested in his hand again, the earlier call to Marcus still echoing in his mind, and he resisted the urge to push further, to gather information quickly, to reduce the unknown into something manageable, because Amara's words had made one thing clear: This was not a situation to be analyzed from a distance. It was something that required presence, something that required him to show up in ways he had never needed to before. He leaned back slightly, his eyes closing for a brief second as he let the silence settle around him. And in that silence, memories began to surface more clearly. Not fragments now, but sequences, moments that had once felt insignificant but now carried weight. The way Amara had looked at him years ago, the quiet strength she had always carried, the way she had never demanded more than what was freely given, and the realization that he had walked away from something real without understanding it settled into him with a quiet certainty that could not be undone. Inside the apartment, Noah had finished eating, his earlier questions no longer pressing, replaced by the steady comfort of routine, and Amara stood, clearing the table, her movements as composed as ever, but beneath that composure was awareness, not of fear, not of disruption, but of change, the kind that required attention but not reaction, the kind that unfolded over time rather than all at once. She guided Noah through the rest of the evening, the small rituals that marked the end of the day, brushing his teeth, reading a short story, tucking him into bed with the same care she had always given. And as she pulled the blanket up around him, he looked at her one more time, his eyes thoughtful but calm. "You are not going anywhere, right?" he asked. And Amara's hand rested gently on his shoulder, her voice soft but certain as she answered, "I am, right here." And that was all he needed. His eyes closing moments later as sleep came easily, unburdened by the weight of what had changed beyond his understanding. Amara stood there for a moment longer, watching him, her expression unreadable but steady, before she turned and walked quietly out of the room, closing the door behind her with a soft click. And as she stepped into the living room, she moved toward the window, her gaze drifting toward the street below, where the car still sat, where Ethan still remained, and she did not look surprised to see it there, did not react with frustration or concern. She simply observed, taking in the reality of what had begun, and after a moment, she reached up and gently pulled the curtain closed, not to shut him out entirely, but to define the space that belonged to her and her son, a boundary drawn not with force, but with quiet certainty. Outside, Ethan opened his eyes again, sensing the shift even without seeing it, and he looked up at the now covered window, understanding the message without needing it to be spoken, and he nodded slightly to himself, not in defeat, but in recognition, because for the first time, he was not trying to break through a barrier. He was learning how to respect it, and as the engine of the car started quietly beneath him, he did not feel like he was leaving something behind. He felt like he was beginning to understand how to approach it the right way. Morning arrived quietly, the kind of soft gray light that slipped through curtains before the city fully woke, and inside the apartment, Amara was already up, moving through the kitchen with the same steady rhythm that defined everything she did. The sound of coffee brewing low and consistent, the faint clink of a spoon against a ceramic mug marking time in a way that felt grounded and intentional. While down the hallway, Noah stirred slowly, the remnants of sleep still soft around him as he pushed himself upright in bed, blinking against the light as the memory of the previous evening returned not as confusion, but as a quiet awareness that something had shifted, something he did not fully understand yet but could feel in the space around him. He climbed out of bed, padding down the hallway in small, measured steps, and when he reached the kitchen, he paused in the doorway, watching his mother for a moment before stepping inside. His presence light but noticeable, and Amara turned slightly, her gaze meeting his with a small, calm acknowledgement that carried no urgency, no tension, just presence, and she set a plate on the table as she said, "Good morning," her tone even, as if nothing had changed, and in many ways, that was intentional, because stability was something she protected carefully, especially when the world outside tried to shift its shape. Noah nodded, sliding into his seat, his hands resting on the edge of the table as he looked at her, not immediately speaking, but thinking, processing, and after a moment, he asked, "Is he still here?" And the question was simple, direct, and Amara did not avoid it. She did not soften it or redirect it. She simply answered, "No," placing the plate in front of him before sitting across from him, her posture relaxed but attentive, and Noah accepted that answer with a small nod, though his eyes lingered on her for a second longer. as if measuring something deeper, something he trusted her to hold steady. Across the street, the city was already beginning to move. Early commuters stepping onto sidewalks, cars pulling into traffic, and inside a sleek office high above the noise, Ethan Caldwell stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, the skyline stretching out in front of him in clean lines and structured precision, the kind of view that had always represented control, success, clarity. But today it felt different, not diminished, but incomplete, as if something essential had been placed outside of it, beyond the reach of everything he had built. His phone sat on the desk behind him, screen lit with messages, reminders, meetings stacked back to back, all waiting for his attention, all part of the life he had mastered. But he had not touched it yet, not since he walked in, because his mind had not returned to business. It had stayed where it had been left, replaying moments that now carried weight he could not ignore. Amara's calm certainty, Noah's quiet presence, the boundaries that had been drawn without force but with absolute clarity. A soft knock came at the door, and before Ethan could respond, it opened slightly, Marcus stepping in with the careful professionalism that had defined years of working alongside him. A tablet in hand, his posture composed but his eyes attentive, reading the shift in the room even if he did not fully understand it. "Your 9 o'clock meeting is ready," Marcus said, his tone respectful, precise. And Ethan did not turn immediately, his gaze still fixed on the city as he processed the words, not dismissing them, not ignoring them, but placing them in a context that no longer felt central. After a moment, he spoke, "Reschedule it." And the words were simple, but Marcus hesitated for a fraction of a second, not out of defiance, but out of recognition that this was not something that happened often, not without explanation. "All of them," Ethan added, his voice calm, leaving no room for misunderstanding, and Marcus nodded, adjusting immediately. "Of course," he said, turning to step out, but before he reached the door, Ethan spoke again, and Marcus, and the assistant paused, turning back slightly. "Do not dig into her life," Ethan continued, his tone deliberate. "I do not want reports. I do not want background summaries. I do not want her reduced to data." And Marcus held his gaze for a second, understanding now that this was not a standard request. This was something personal, something that required a different approach. "Understood," he replied. And this time there was no hesitation as he left the room, closing the door quietly behind him. Ethan finally turned then, walking slowly toward his desk, his hand brushing lightly against the surface as he passed, not stopping, not sitting, just moving, as if staying still would pull him back into a version of himself that no longer fit as easily as it once had. And he picked up his phone, not to check messages, not to return calls, but to do something far simpler, something that felt unfamiliar in its simplicity. He searched for a local elementary school near the address he had memorized the night before, not because he had been told, but because he had observed, had paid attention in a way he rarely needed to before, and the result appeared quickly. A small community school, just a few blocks from the apartment, and he stared at the name for a moment, letting the reality of it settle in. This was part of Noah's world, a place he walked into every day, a place filled with routines and relationships that Ethan had never been part of. Back in the apartment, Amara was helping Noah get ready for school, adjusting the strap of his backpack, smoothing down his shirt with careful hands, her movements practiced, steady, and Noah stood still, allowing it, his trust evident in the way he leaned slightly into her touch. And as she finished, he looked up at her again, his eyes thoughtful. "If he comes back," he said quietly, "do I have to talk to him?" And Amara held his gaze, her answer immediate, clear. "You never have to do anything you are not ready for." And that assurance settled into him with quiet certainty, his shoulders relaxing slightly as he nodded, accepting the boundary as something that belonged to him, not something imposed on him. They stepped outside together a few minutes later, the morning air crisp, the sidewalk already alive with movement, and Amara walked beside him at the same steady pace, her presence constant, grounding. And as they approached the corner, Noah glanced around briefly, his eyes scanning in a way that was subtle but noticeable, and Amara saw it. Of course she did, but she did not comment, did not draw attention to it. She simply continued walking, allowing him to process in his own way. Across the street, parked a little further down this time, Ethan sat in The back of his car, his gaze focused but not intrusive, watching from a distance that respected the boundary he had been given. And when he saw them step onto the sidewalk, something in his chest shifted again, not sharply, not painfully, but steadily, like something aligning into place one piece at a time. And he did not step out, did not approach. He remained where he was, present but not imposing, learning, slowly, what it meant to stay without taking, to be there without demanding. And as Noah and Amara continued down the street toward the school, Ethan watched, not as a man trying to reclaim something, but as someone beginning to understand what it would take to deserve a place in a life that had already been built without him. The school building came into view with its wide brick entrance and bright blue doors, the kind of place that carried the steady rhythm of childhood in every detail. And as Amara and Noah approached, the sounds of morning energy grew clearer, children laughing, backpacks shifting, teachers greeting students with practiced warmth, and Noah's pace slowed just slightly, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, his eyes taking in everything the way he always did, quietly, thoughtfully. And Amara noticed. Of course she did, her hand resting briefly on his shoulder as they reached the gate, grounding him without interrupting the flow of his movement. "I will be here after school," she said, her voice calm, certain, and Noah nodded, looking up at her for a second longer before stepping forward, his small figure blending into the line of children entering the building. And Amara watched until he disappeared inside, her gaze steady, not lingering in worry, but anchored in presence, making sure he crossed that threshold with the same quiet confidence she had spent years building into him. Across the street, Ethan remained in the back seat of the car, his view partially obscured by the flow of parents and students, but he had seen enough to understand the routine, the pattern, the structure of a life that had never included him. And as Noah disappeared into the building, something in Ethan shifted again, not sharply, not painfully, but with a quiet weight that settled deeper than before, because now the distance was not just emotional. It was lived, measured in mornings and afternoons, in routines that repeated without him. Amara turned away from the school entrance and began walking back down the sidewalk, her pace unchanged, her posture steady, and Ethan watched as she moved, not following immediately this time, not stepping out of the car, but observing, learning the rhythm of her world before trying to enter it. And when she passed the spot where the car was parked, she did not stop, did not turn, but her gaze shifted slightly, just enough to acknowledge his presence without giving it power. And then she continued walking, leaving the moment exactly where she wanted it, defined, controlled, hers. Ethan remained still for a few seconds after she passed, his hand resting lightly on the edge of the seat as he considered the next step, not in terms of strategy, but in terms of presence, something that still felt unfamiliar, something that required patience instead of action. And after a moment, he spoke quietly to the driver. "Take me to the office," his voice calm, measured, and the car moved forward smoothly, merging back into the flow of the city as if nothing had changed, even though everything had. Inside the office, the day unfolded as it always did on the surface, meetings rescheduled into tighter clusters, calls redirected, decisions waiting for his input, and yet Ethan moved through it. Differently, his focus divided in a way it had never been before, because every moment of stillness, every pause between conversations, brought him back to the same place, the sidewalk outside the school, the look in Noah's eyes, the quiet certainty in Amara's voice. And it did not disrupt his work, not visibly, but it shifted the way he approached it, the way he listened, the way he responded, as if something deeper had been unlocked that could not be ignored. At midday, Marcus stepped into the office again, his tablet in hand, his posture as composed as ever, but his eyes more attentive now, aware that something had changed even if the details remained unspoken. "There is a request from the board regarding the education initiative," he said, placing the tablet on the desk, and Ethan glanced down at it briefly, scanning the summary without fully engaging, until one detail caught his attention, a partnership proposal with several local schools, including the one he had seen that morning, and he paused, his gaze lingering on the name for a second longer than necessary. "Set a meeting with the school administration," Ethan said, his tone calm, direct, and Marcus nodded, though there was a slight shift in his expression, a recognition that this decision was not purely business. "Yes, sir," he replied, making a note, and Ethan added, "No publicity," his voice firm but not sharp. "This is not for press." And Marcus nodded again, understanding the instruction clearly, adjusting his approach without question. Across town, Amara had returned home, the quiet of the apartment settling around her as she moved through the space with the same steady rhythm, her mind not replaying the morning, not analyzing it, but holding it in a place of awareness that did not demand immediate action, because she understood something Ethan was only beginning to learn, that not every shift required response. Some required observation, patience, time. She sat by the window for a moment, a cup of coffee in her hands, her gaze drifting out toward the street below, and she did not look for the car, did not expect it, but she remained aware of the possibility, of the presence that had entered their lives and would not simply disappear now that it had been acknowledged. Hours passed, the day moving forward in its usual rhythm, and when the time came, she stepped out again, walking the familiar path. Back to the school, her steps steady, her presence calm, and as she approached the building, the sound of children filled the air once more, the end of the school day carrying its own kind of energy, louder, less structured, more open. Noah emerged with the other children, his backpack slightly askew, his expression calm but observant, and when he saw her, he moved toward her without hesitation, his pace quickening just slightly, and she met him halfway, her hand resting on his shoulder as she adjusted the strap of his bag, grounding him again in that same quiet way. "How was your day?" she asked, and Noah nodded. "Good," he said simply, but after a moment, he added, "He was there this morning." And Amara's gaze remained steady, her response calm. "I know," she said, and Noah looked up at her, processing. He did not come close. He continued, and there was something in his tone, not concern, not fear, just observation, and Amara nodded slightly. "That was his choice," she said, and Noah accepted that, the simplicity of the answer aligning with the way he understood the world. Across the street, parked further down again, Ethan sat in the car, his gaze focused on the school entrance, watching as the children spilled out, watching as Noah appeared, and when their eyes met briefly across the distance, Ethan did not move, did not signal. He simply held the moment for what it was, a connection that existed without being forced, and Noah looked at him for a second longer this time, not confused, not distant, just aware. And then he turned back to Amara, walking beside her as they moved away together. Ethan remained where he was, his hands resting loosely in his lap, the usual impulse to act, to step out, to speak, held in check by something stronger now, something he was only beginning to understand. And as the car idled quietly beneath him, he realized that this was not about claiming a place. It was about earning one, slowly, consistently, without expectation, and, for the first time in his life, that did not feel like a limitation. It felt like a path he was willing to learn. The next morning arrived with a different kind of stillness, not the quiet of routine, but the quiet of something beginning to take shape beneath the surface. And Ethan Caldwell felt it the moment he stepped out of his car in front of the modest brick school, this time not from across the street, not from behind glass or distance, but standing on the same sidewalk where parents gathered, where children walked past him without recognizing the weight he carried, and he did not move to stand out, did not signal his presence with authority or attention. He simply stood there, dressed differently than usual, yet carrying himself with a restraint that was new, a deliberate choice to exist in the space without trying to define it. The morning air was crisp, the kind that carried the low hum of early conversations, the rustle of backpacks, the soft greetings exchanged between parents who knew each other, and Ethan observed all of it quietly, absorbing the rhythm instead of disrupting it, his gaze shifting only when he saw them, Amara and Noah approaching from the same direction. As before, their pace steady, their presence grounded in something that did not depend on the world around them. Amara noticed him immediately. Of course she did, her eyes settling on him for a brief second before returning forward, her expression unchanged, neither surprised nor unsettled, but aware, always aware, and Noah followed her gaze a moment later, his eyes landing on Ethan with that same quiet observation he had shown the day before, and this time, Ethan did not look away, did not Retreat into distance. He simply inclined his head slightly, not as a greeting that demanded response, but as an acknowledgement that left the choice entirely with them. Noah slowed just a fraction, his hand still in Amara's, and there was a pause, subtle but present, as if something in the moment had shifted just enough to be noticed, and then he looked up at Amara, not asking, not speaking, but seeking direction in the way children do when something unfamiliar enters their space, and Amara did not stop walking, but she did not pull him forward either. She allowed the moment to exist, to unfold naturally, and after a second, Noah took a small step forward on his own, closing a tiny portion of the distance that had separated him from Ethan, and Ethan felt it, that movement, not physically, but internally, like a door opening just slightly, not enough to step through, but enough to see that it was not locked. "Good morning," Ethan said, his voice low, calm, stripped of any expectation, and Noah looked at him for a second, his expression thoughtful, before responding softly, "Good morning." The words simple, but carrying more weight than they should have, because they were given freely, not forced, not guided, just offered, and Ethan nodded once, accepting it for exactly what it was, nothing more, nothing less. Amara remained still for a moment, her gaze moving between them, not interfering, not encouraging, simply observing, and then she spoke, her voice even. "We are going to be late." And it was not a dismissal, not a rejection, it was a boundary, clear and calm, and Noah nodded, his attention shifting back to her as he stepped away from Ethan, the moment closing as naturally as it had opened, and Ethan did not follow, did not extend it beyond what was given. He simply watched as they continued toward the entrance, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his posture relaxed but attentive, understanding now that progress did not come from pushing, it came from presence. The school doors opened and closed as children entered, and Noah disappeared inside once again, leaving Ethan standing among strangers who moved around him without noticing the quiet significance of what had just occurred. And for a moment, he remained there, letting it settle, letting himself feel it without analyzing it. And then he turned, walking back toward the car, his steps steady, his mind clearer than it had been the day before, not because he had answers, but because he had direction. Across town, the office felt different again, not because anything had changed externally, but because Ethan moved through it with a focus that no longer centered solely on outcomes, but on alignment. And when Marcus entered with the update about the school meeting, Ethan listened fully, not scanning, not multitasking, just present. "They are available this afternoon," Marcus said, his tone professional, and Ethan nodded. "I will go," he replied, and Marcus hesitated slightly. "Shall I prepare a briefing?" he asked, and Ethan shook his head. "No briefing," he said calmly. "I am not going there as a CEO." And Marcus held his gaze for a second before nodding, understanding the distinction even if it did not fit the usual pattern. The school administration office was small, functional, filled with the quiet energy of educators who balanced structure with care, and when Ethan walked in, he was greeted not with recognition, but with polite curiosity, the kind reserved for someone unfamiliar but not unwelcome. And he introduced himself simply, without titles, without emphasis. And as the conversation unfolded, he listened more than he spoke, learning about the programs, the needs, the challenges, not as a transaction, but as context, something he had rarely needed to seek before. "We try to give every child the attention they need," the principal said, her voice steady, and Ethan nodded, his thoughts briefly returning to Noah, to the quiet way he observed the world, the way he processed before reacting, and he understood, in that moment, that attention was not something that could be measured in resources alone. It required presence, consistency, time, and that realization settled into him with a quiet certainty that did not demand immediate action, but would shape everything that came next. Later that afternoon, as the school day ended again, Amara stood outside the entrance, waiting, her posture calm, her gaze steady, and when Noah appeared, he moved toward her with the same quiet confidence, his eyes scanning briefly before settling on her. And then, almost as an afterthought, they shifted again, finding Ethan standing a little closer than the day before, not beside them, not in front of them, but present. And Noah did not stop this time, did not hesitate. He simply looked at him and said, "You came back." And Ethan nodded, his voice steady as he replied, "I said I would." And there was no promise in the words, no expectation, just truth, simple and clear, and Noah accepted it with a small nod, as if filing it away, not deciding anything yet, but not dismissing it either. And Amara watched the exchange without interruption, her expression unchanged, but her awareness sharp, measuring not the words, but the consistency behind them, because she knew that in moments like this, what mattered was not what was said once, but what was shown over time. And as they turned to walk away together, Ethan remained where he was for a second longer before following at a respectful distance, not closing the gap, not claiming space, but staying, just as he had been told, learning, slowly, what it meant to be part of something that could not be rushed, only earned. The rhythm of the next few days did not announce itself with dramatic change, but with repetition, quiet, steady, deliberate repetition, and that was where the difference began to take shape, not in words, not in promises, but in presence that did not disappear when the moment passed. Because each morning, before the school doors opened, Ethan Caldwell was there, not always in the same spot, not always standing still, but always within sight, always consistent, and the people around him began to recognize the pattern even if they did not understand it. The way he arrived early, the way he remained composed, the way he did not intrude or interrupt, just observed, just stayed. On the fourth morning, the air carried a slight chill, the kind that made breath visible for a second before it disappeared, and no one noticed him before Amara did this time, his gaze shifting across the sidewalk with quiet awareness. And when his eyes landed on Ethan, there was no hesitation, no pause, just recognition, simple and clear, and he said softly, "He is here again." And Amara followed his gaze, her expression unchanged as she nodded once, acknowledging the reality without reacting to it, because she had already seen the pattern forming, and patterns, when repeated long enough, begin to mean something. Ethan inclined his head slightly as they approached, the same restrained acknowledgement he had offered before, and Noah responded with a small nod of his own. The exchange brief, almost subtle, but it carried continuity, something that linked one day to the next without needing to be spoken aloud. "Good morning," Ethan said, his voice calm, and Noah answered again, a little more certain this time. "Good morning." And Amara remained still for a second, her eyes resting on Ethan not with challenge, not with approval, but with quiet evaluation, measuring not the words, but the consistency behind them, because she understood something he was only beginning to learn, that trust is not built in declarations, it is built in repetition. "We should go," she said, her tone steady. And Noah nodded, stepping forward without resistance, his hand brushing lightly against her side as they moved toward the entrance, and Ethan did not follow, did not extend the moment beyond what was given. He simply remained where he was, letting it settle, understanding now that even the smallest exchanges carried weight when they were earned. Inside the school, Noah moved through his day as he always did, quiet, observant, attentive in a way that teachers appreciated without fully noticing. His presence steady, his focus consistent, but something had shifted, not in distraction, not in confusion, but in awareness, the kind that made him glance toward the windows once or twice, not searching, just checking, as if confirming that what had been there in the morning had not disappeared entirely. Across town, Ethan moved through his work with the same outward precision, but internally, the structure had changed. Meetings were no longer just objectives, they were interruptions, moments, that pulled him away from something that felt more immediate, more real. And Marcus noticed it, not because Ethan faltered, but because he adjusted, his priorities shifting in subtle ways that did not align with his usual patterns. "The board is asking for your presence at the quarterly review," Marcus said during a brief pause between calls, his tone professional, and Ethan looked up from his desk, his gaze steady but thoughtful. "Reschedule it for next week," he replied, and Marcus hesitated slightly. "They may not agree to that," he said carefully, and Ethan's expression did not change, but his voice carried quiet certainty. "They will." And the conversation ended there, not with force, but with a clarity that left no room for negotiation, because for the first time, something else had taken precedence. When the afternoon came, Ethan returned to the school again, this time stepping out of the car fully, standing on the sidewalk where parents gathered, his presence no longer hidden behind distance, but still respectful, still measured. And when the doors opened and the children began to pour out, his gaze found Noah immediately, not because he searched urgently, but because recognition had already been established, and Noah saw him too, his expression calm, his steps steady as he walked toward Amara, who stood waiting in her usual spot. "You are here again," Noah said when he reached Ethan's line of sight, his voice neutral but observant, and Ethan nodded. "Yes," he replied simply, not adding more, not explaining, because he understood now that consistency did not need justification. It needed continuation. Amara's gaze moved between them, her posture unchanged, her presence grounded, and she did not interrupt, did not redirect. She allowed the exchange to exist, but she did not expand it, because boundaries, once set, are not removed easily. They are adjusted carefully, if at all. "We are going home," she said after a moment, and Noah nodded. But before turning away, he looked at Ethan again, his eyes thoughtful. "Do you always come here?" he asked, and the question was simple, but it carried something deeper, something that reached beyond curiosity into expectation, and Ethan paused for a fraction of a second before answering, not because he did not know what to say, but because he understood the weight of the answer. "I come because you are here," he said, his voice steady, and Noah processed that, his expression unchanged, but his silence carried meaning, and after a moment, he nodded once, accepting the answer without fully understanding it yet, and then he turned. Walking beside Amara as they moved away, Ethan remained where he was, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his gaze following them until they reached the corner, and even then, he did not move immediately. He let the moment settle, because each day was building something, slowly, deliberately, something that could not be rushed, and for the first time, he did not feel the need to accelerate it. He understood that what was being built required patience, required presence, required him to become someone who could stand there day after day without demanding more than what was given. Inside the apartment that evening, Noah sat at the small table, his homework spread out in front of him, his pencil moving steadily across the page, and after a few minutes, he looked up at Amara, who was preparing dinner, her movements as calm as ever, and he said, "He keeps coming back," and Amara nodded slightly, not turning. "Yes," she said, and Noah watched her for a second before asking, "Why?" And she paused briefly, her hands resting on the counter as she considered the answer, not because it was difficult, but because it needed to be clear. "Because he is trying to learn," she said finally, and Noah tilted his head slightly. "Learn what?" he asked, and Amara turned then, her gaze meeting his, steady, certain. "How to stay," she answered, and Noah held her gaze for a moment, processing, and then he nodded slowly, returning to his work, the answer settling into him in a way that did not require further explanation, because even at his age, he understood that staying was not something people always knew how to do. And as the evening continued, the quiet rhythm of their life remained intact, steady, grounded, while outside, beyond the walls of the apartment, something new continued to take shape, not through force, not through urgency, but through the simple, consistent act of showing up, again and again, until presence itself began to mean something. By the end of the week, the pattern was no longer invisible. It had settled into something recognizable, something that did not need explanation because it had proven itself through repetition. And on that Friday afternoon, as the school doors opened and children poured out with the familiar energy of the weekend approaching, Noah stepped through with a different kind of awareness in his eyes, something more grounded, more certain. And when he saw Ethan standing in the same place, not closer, not further, exactly where he had been every day, he did not just observe it this time. He expected it. Amara stood beside him, her posture calm, her presence steady as always, but her awareness sharpened in a way that did not show outwardly, because she had seen the shift, not just in Ethan, but in Noah, the way the repetition had begun to create a quiet form of trust, not declared, not defined, but forming nonetheless. Noah adjusted the strap of his backpack as he stepped closer, his gaze moving from Amara to Ethan and back again. And then he spoke, his voice calm but clear. "You did not miss a day." And the statement was simple, but it carried recognition, and Ethan nodded slightly, his expression composed but softer than it had been when this began. "No," he replied, and there was no emphasis, no need to highlight it, because the truth of it had already been demonstrated. There was a pause then, not uncomfortable, not uncertain, just a space where something new could exist if it was allowed to, and Noah looked at him for a second longer before asking, "Do you have to go somewhere else now?" And Ethan understood the question immediately, not just the words, but what was behind them, the quiet testing of consistency beyond the moment, and he answered without hesitation, "I go where I need to be," he said, his voice steady, and Noah tilted his head slightly, processing. "And this is where you need to be," he followed, not as a question, but as a conclusion forming in real time, and Ethan held his gaze. "Yes," he said simply. Amara watched the exchange without interruption, her eyes moving between them, not guiding, not interfering, just observing the shape of something that had not existed a week ago, something that was building itself slowly, piece by piece, through presence and restraint. "We should head home," she said after a moment, her tone even, and Noah nodded, but before turning away, he looked at Ethan again, his expression thoughtful. "Do you want to walk with us?" he asked, and the question hung there, quiet but significant, because it was the first time the distance had been challenged from his side, not removed, not erased, but questioned, and Ethan did not respond immediately, not because he did not want to, but because he understood that the answer did not belong entirely to him. His gaze shifted briefly to Amara, and she met it with the same calm steadiness she had carried from the beginning, her silence deliberate, giving no direction, no approval, no denial, leaving the moment exactly where it needed to be. After a second, Ethan nodded once, not stepping forward yet, not assuming, just acknowledging. "If that is okay," he said, his voice low. And Noah looked at Amara again, his eyes searching not for permission, but for alignment, and she held his gaze for a second before giving a small, almost imperceptible nod, not opening the door wide, but allowing it to move just enough. They began walking then, not side by side at first, but with Ethan slightly behind, maintaining the space that had defined the past few days, and Noah walked between them, his step steady, his presence calm, as if he were adjusting to the new formation without needing it to be explained. The city moved around them as it always did, cars passing, people talking, the rhythm of the afternoon settling into the early evening, and for a while, no one spoke, the silence not empty, but full, carrying the weight of something that was still finding its balance. After a few minutes, Noah glanced back slightly, his voice breaking the quiet in a way that felt natural. "Do you work in a building like that?" he asked, pointing toward a tall glass structure in the distance, and Ethan followed his gesture, nodding. "Yes," he said. "I work in a place like that." And Noah considered that for a moment, his gaze lingering on the building before returning forward. "Do you like it?" he asked, and the question was simple, but it caught Ethan off guard in a way he did not expect, because it was not about success, not about achievement, it was about feeling, something he had not been asked about in a long time. "I used to," Ethan answered honestly, and Noah looked at him again, curious. "What about now?" he asked, and Ethan paused for a brief second, his eyes shifting forward as he considered the answer. "Now I am not sure," he said, his voice calm, and Noah nodded slowly, accepting that without needing more, because uncertainty was not something that needed to be solved immediately. It was something that could exist. Amara listened without reacting, her expression unchanged, but there was a quiet awareness in her posture, a recognition that something had shifted, not in a dramatic way, but in a real one, because Ethan was no longer speaking from position. He was speaking from presence, and that difference mattered more than anything he could say. When they reached the corner near the apartment building, Noah slowed slightly, his steps aligning more closely with Amara's, and he looked at Ethan one more time. "Are you coming tomorrow?" he asked, and this time, there was no hesitation in Ethan's response, not because the question was simple, but because the answer had already been proven. "Yes," he said, and Noah nodded, the response settling into him as something reliable, something he could hold on to without questioning. Amara turned toward the building, her hand resting lightly on Noah's shoulder as they stepped toward the entrance, And before they went inside, she glanced back at Ethan, her eyes meeting his with a quiet steadiness that carried no judgment, no approval, just acknowledgement. And for a moment, that was enough, because it was not rejection, it was not distance, it was recognition of what had been done, what had been shown, and what still remained to be proven. The door closed behind them, leaving Ethan standing on the sidewalk once again. But this time, the space felt different, not because the distance had disappeared, but because it had been crossed, even if only slightly. And as he turned back toward the car, the city lights beginning to flicker on around him, he understood that this was not about reaching an end. It was about continuing a process, one that required the same thing every day: showing up, staying present, and allowing trust to build in the only way it ever truly does: through time. The next morning did not feel like the beginning of something new, but like the continuation of something that had already chosen its direction. And when Ethan Caldwell stepped onto the sidewalk outside the school, the air carried a quiet familiarity that had not existed a week ago, a sense that his presence there no longer felt like an interruption, but like a pattern the space had begun to recognize. And he stood there with the same restraint, the same measured stillness. But inside, something had shifted again, not in urgency, but in understanding. Because what had started as a question had slowly become a commitment he could not ignore. Parents moved around him in their usual rhythm, some exchanging small talk, some focused on their children, and a few had begun to glance at him with quiet curiosity, not because he stood out in appearance, but because consistency creates its own kind of visibility, and Ethan did not react to it, did not adjust his posture or his presence. He simply remained where he was, grounded in the same intention that had brought him there every day. When Amara and Noah appeared at the end of the sidewalk, their pace steady as always, Ethan noticed something different immediately, not in their movement, but in the way Noah looked at him, not with simple observation anymore, but with recognition that carried expectation, something small but significant. And as they approached, Noah did not wait for the moment to form naturally. He stepped into it, his voice calm but direct as he said, "You said you would be here." And Ethan nodded, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "I did," he replied, his tone steady, and Noah gave a small nod in return, as if confirming something for himself, something that did not need to be explained. Amara stood beside him, her posture unchanged, her presence as composed as ever, but her gaze lingered on Ethan a second longer than before, not questioning, not challenging, just observing the continuation of something that had not broken, and that mattered more than anything that could be said. "We should go," she said, her voice even, and Noah nodded, but he did not step forward immediately, his attention shifting back to Ethan. "Do you come here before work?" he asked, and the question carried a quiet curiosity that was no longer distant, and Ethan responded without overthinking it. "Yes," he said, "I come here first." And Noah considered that for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly in thought. "That means you changed your schedule," he said, not as an accusation, but as an observation, and Ethan felt the weight of that recognition more than he expected, because it was true, not in a small way, but in a fundamental one, and he answered honestly, "Yes," and Noah nodded again, the answer settling into him with a kind of quiet acceptance that felt older than his years. They walked toward the entrance together, the distance between them unchanged but no longer defined by uncertainty. And as they reached the doors, Noah paused briefly, looking at Ethan once more. "You can say goodbye," he said simply, and the statement carried something new, not permission exactly, but allowance, and Ethan understood it for what it was, a small opening, one that required the same care as everything else. "Have a good day," Ethan said, his voice calm, and Noah nodded. "You too," he replied, before stepping inside, leaving Ethan standing there with the echo of a moment that had not been forced, not directed, but given. The school doors closed, and Ethan remained for a few seconds longer, his gaze steady, not searching, not waiting, just present. And then he turned, walking back toward the car, his steps measured, his mind clearer than it had been before, not because everything was resolved, but because something had been established, something that could be built on. The day unfolded with the same external structure, meetings, calls, decisions, but Ethan moved through it differently again. Not distracted, not unfocused, but aligned in a way that shifted his priorities without disrupting his capability. And when Marcus entered with the usual updates, Ethan listened fully, responding with the same precision. But his time was no longer entirely his own. It was divided, intentionally, by something that required presence beyond the office. There is a request for a press release regarding the school partnership, Marcus said at one point, his tone professional, and Ethan looked up, his expression calm but firm. No press, he said, and Marcus nodded, adjusting immediately. Understood. And the conversation moved on, but the decision carried weight, because it reinforced something Ethan had already chosen, that this was not about visibility, it was about reality. When the afternoon came, Ethan returned to the school again, stepping out of the car without hesitation, his place on the sidewalk now familiar enough that he did not need to consider where to stand. And as the children began to leave, his gaze found Noah quickly, not with urgency, but with recognition that had become instinctive. Noah walked toward Amara as always, but this time, his steps slowed slightly before he reached her, his attention shifting back to Ethan, and he spoke before anything else could settle. "We are going to the park today," he said, his tone calm, and Ethan nodded. "That sounds good," he replied, not assuming more, not asking to join, just acknowledging what was shared. Noah looked at him for a second longer, then glanced at Amara, his expression thoughtful, and she met his gaze with the same steady calm, not guiding him, not deciding for him, just allowing him to find his own direction. And after a moment, Noah spoke again. "You can come if you want," he said, the words simple, but carrying more weight than anything before, because this was not just acknowledgement, it was invitation. Ethan did not respond immediately, his eyes shifting briefly to Amara, and she held his gaze for a second, her expression unchanged, but her silence carried something new, not resistance, not distance, but consideration, and that was enough. "If that is okay," Ethan said, his voice low, and Noah nodded once, as if the answer had already been decided, and Amara turned slightly, her posture steady as she began walking, Noah beside her, and Ethan followed, not closing the distance completely, but no longer held entirely outside of it. The park was a few blocks away, a small green space surrounded by trees and quiet benches, the kind of place where the city softened just enough to allow moments to breathe. And as they entered, Noah moved ahead slightly, his steps lighter now, his attention shifting toward the open space, and Ethan slowed, allowing that movement, understanding that this was still not about taking space, but about being present within it. Amara sat on a nearby bench, her posture relaxed but attentive, her gaze following Noah as he moved, and Ethan remained standing for a moment before sitting at the far end of the bench, maintaining the same careful distance that had defined everything so far, and the silence that settled between them was not empty, it was measured, carrying the weight of everything that had been built and everything that still remained uncertain. "You are consistent," Amara said after a moment, her voice calm, not looking at him directly, and Ethan felt the words settle in, not as praise, not as judgment, but as recognition, and he nodded slightly. "I am trying to be," he replied, his tone steady, and she glanced at him then, her gaze sharp but not unkind. "Trying is not enough," she said, and the words landed with the same quiet precision as everything she had said before, and Ethan did not argue, did not defend, he simply nodded again. Because he understood now that this was not about effort alone, it was about time, about proof, about becoming something that could not be questioned. And as Noah ran across the grass in the distance, his laughter soft but real, Ethan watched him, not with the urgency of someone trying to claim a place, but with the patience of someone learning how to deserve one, and for the first time, that felt like the only path that mattered. The late afternoon light stretched across the park in long golden lines, softening the edges of everything it touched, and Noah's laughter carried across the open space as he moved between the swings and the low climbing structure, his small figure weaving through the rhythm of other children with a quiet confidence that came from familiarity. And Ethan Caldwell watched him with a stillness that had become natural now, not rigid, not uncertain, but present in a way that did not demand anything. From the moment, and beside him, Amara remained seated at the far end of the bench, her posture relaxed but aware, her gaze following Noah with the same steady attention she had always given, and the silence between them was no longer unfamiliar. It had settled into something measured, something that did not need to be filled to be understood. He watches everything before he moves, Ethan said after a while, his voice low, not breaking the quiet but existing within it. And Amara did not look at him immediately, her eyes still on Noah as she replied. He learned that early, and there was no pride in her tone, no defensiveness, just truth, and Ethan nodded slightly, understanding that what he was seeing was not personality alone, it was experience, it was adaptation. It was the result of a life shaped carefully without him. Noah ran toward them then, slowing as he approached, his breath steady despite the movement, his eyes bright but focused, and he stopped a few feet away, looking at Ethan with a kind of directness that had grown stronger over the past days. "Do you know how to play catch?" he asked, and the question was simple, but it carried an invitation that had not existed before, something that extended beyond words into action, and Ethan did not hesitate, not because he was confident, but because he understood the importance of the moment. "Yes," he said, standing slowly, his movements controlled but natural, and Noah nodded, satisfied with the answer, before turning and jogging a few steps away, picking up a small ball that had been left near the edge of the grass. Ethan followed at a measured pace, not closing the distance too quickly, allowing Noah to set the rhythm, and when the ball was tossed toward him, he caught it easily, the motion familiar but different now, because it was not about skill, it was about connection, and he tossed it back, careful, controlled, matching Noah's pace, and for several minutes, they continued like that, the ball moving between them in a quiet exchange that required no explanation, no pressure, just presence. Amara watched from the bench, her gaze steady, her expression unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in her posture, a recognition of what was happening, not as a moment of resolution, but as a step, small, deliberate, and she did not interrupt, did not call Noah back. She allowed it to exist, to unfold, because she understood that some things could not be built through words alone. They needed space, time, repetition. When Noah eventually slowed, the game ending naturally as his attention shifted, he walked back toward her, the ball tucked under his arm, and he glanced at Ethan once more before sitting beside Amara, his breathing steady, his expression calm, and Ethan returned to the bench as well, sitting at the same careful distance, not assuming closeness, not stepping beyond what had been given. "You did not miss," Noah said after a moment, his tone thoughtful, and Ethan gave a small nod. "I tried not to," he replied, and Noah considered that, his gaze dropping briefly to the ball in his hands before lifting again. "Do you always try?" he asked, and Ethan paused for a fraction of a second, the question settling deeper than it seemed on the surface, because it was not about the game, it was about consistency, about effort, about intention, and he answered honestly. "Not always," he said, his voice steady. "But I am trying now," and Noah held his gaze for a moment longer before nodding. The answer accepted not because it was perfect, but because it was real. The sun dipped lower, the lights softening further, and the park began to quiet as families started to leave, the rhythm of the evening taking shape, and Amara stood, brushing her hands lightly against her coat, her movements unhurried. "It is time," she said, her voice calm, and Noah nodded, standing as well. And Ethan rose with them, not stepping forward, not assuming anything beyond what had already been established. They walked back toward the street together, the distance between them still present but no longer uncertain. And when they reached the corner, Noah slowed slightly, his attention shifting between them, and he spoke without hesitation. "We come here again tomorrow." And Amara looked at him, her expression steady. "We will see," she replied, her tone neutral but not dismissive. And Noah accepted that, his gaze turning to Ethan. "Will you come?" he asked, and this time, the question carried something clearer, something that expected consistency rather than tested it, and Ethan nodded. "Yes," he said, his voice calm, and Noah gave a small nod in return. The exchange simple but meaningful. As they reached the building, Amara paused at the entrance, her hand resting lightly on the door handle, and she turned slightly, her gaze meeting Ethan's with a steadiness that had not changed from the beginning. But there was something different in it now, not openness, not acceptance, but recognition of what had been done, what had been shown, and she spoke quietly. "You are still here." And Ethan held her gaze, understanding the weight of those words. "I will be," he replied, not as a promise, but as a statement grounded in action, and she studied him for a second longer before nodding once. Not confirming, not denying, just acknowledging. And then she opened the door, guiding Noah inside, leaving Ethan standing outside once more, but the distance no longer felt the same, because it had been crossed, not completely, not permanently, but enough to change its meaning. The door closed softly, and Ethan remained where he was for a moment, the quiet of the evening settling around him. And for the first time, he did not feel like an outsider looking in. He felt like someone standing at the edge of something real, something that required patience, consistency, and more than anything else, the willingness to stay. And as he turned to leave, the city lights beginning to glow around him, he understood that this was no longer about discovering the past. It was about building something in the present, something that could only exist if he continued to show up, day after day, without expecting anything more than the chance to prove that he could. The next day carried a different kind of weight, not heavier, but clearer, as if the quiet repetition of the past days had settled into something that could no longer be ignored or dismissed. And when Ethan Caldwell stepped onto the sidewalk outside the school, there was no hesitation in his movement, no second-guessing of why he was there, only a steady understanding that this was where he needed to be, not out of obligation, not out of guilt, but because something real had taken root in a space he had once overlooked. The morning air was cool, the sky stretched in pale blue above the buildings, and the familiar rhythm of parents and children filled the space again. But this time, Ethan was not just observing it, he was part of it, even if only at the edges. And when Amara and Noah appeared at the end of the sidewalk, their pace steady as always, there was no surprise in their eyes, only recognition, something quiet but undeniable. Noah saw him first again, his gaze settling on Ethan with a certainty that had replaced the earlier curiosity, and he spoke without hesitation. "You are here?" And Ethan nodded, his expression calm but grounded. "I am," he replied, and Noah gave a small nod in return, not testing the answer anymore, not questioning it, just accepting it as part of the pattern that had formed. Amara stood beside him, her posture composed, her gaze resting on Ethan for a moment longer, not with doubt, not with challenge, but with a kind of quiet assessment that carried the weight of everything that had been shown over time. And she did not speak immediately. She allowed the moment to exist, to settle, before she said, "We are going to be early today," her tone even, not dismissing him, not inviting him, simply stating what was. And Noah glanced at her, then back at Ethan. "You can walk with us," he said, his voice calm. And this time, the words did not feel like a question. They felt like a continuation, something that had already been decided in the space between repetition and trust. Ethan stepped forward then, closing the distance slightly, not fully, not completely, but enough to stand beside them instead of behind, and they walked together toward the school entrance, their pace aligned, their silence no longer uncertain but steady, carrying a sense of balance that had not existed before. "Do you always come back?" Noah asked after a moment, his eyes forward, his voice thoughtful, and Ethan did not rush the answer, not because he doubted it, but because he understood its weight. "Yes," he said, his tone steady. "I come back," and Noah nodded slowly, the words settling into him with a kind of quiet certainty that did not need to be repeated. When they reached the doors, Noah paused, turning to face Ethan fully this time, his expression calm, but direct. "Then you are not just visiting," he said, and the statement held something deeper, something that acknowledged not just presence, but intention, and Ethan met his gaze, holding it with a steadiness that matched the moment. "No," he said, "I am not just visiting." And Noah studied him for a second longer before giving a small nod, as if confirming something he had already begun to understand, and then he turned, stepping inside the school without hesitation, leaving Ethan standing just outside the threshold, but not entirely outside the space anymore. Amara remained there for a moment longer, her gaze meeting Ethan's, and there was a quiet shift in her expression, not dramatic, not obvious, but present, a recognition that something had changed, not completely, not permanently, but enough to matter, and she spoke softly. He notices what stays. And the words carried more than their surface meaning. They held a standard, a truth that had shaped everything up to this point. And Ethan nodded, understanding fully. So do you, he replied, and Amara held his gaze for a second longer before giving a small, almost imperceptible nod, not agreeing, not disagreeing, but acknowledging that he had begun to see something he had not seen before. She turned then, stepping inside, leaving Ethan alone on the sidewalk. But the space did not feel the same as it had in the beginning. It did not feel like distance. It felt like transition, like standing at the edge of something that was no longer out of reach, but not yet fully his. The day moved forward as it always did. The city continuing its rhythm, the office carrying its usual demands. But Ethan moved through it with a clarity that had not existed before, because for the first time, he was not dividing his attention. He was aligning it. Understanding that what mattered most was not what he controlled, but what he chose to show up for. Consistently, without interruption, when the afternoon came, he returned to the school again, stepping out of the car with the same steady presence. And when Noah emerged, his gaze found Ethan immediately, not searching, not scanning, just knowing, and he walked toward him with the same calm confidence that had grown over the past days. You came back again, Noah said, his voice carrying a quiet certainty, and Ethan nodded. I did, he replied, and there was no need for more, because the truth of it had already been established. Amara stood beside Noah, her posture steady, her gaze moving between them, and after a moment, she spoke, her voice calm but clear. We are not changing everything. And the words were not a rejection, not a barrier. They were a boundary, a reminder that what had been built would not be undone by what was new. And Ethan nodded immediately. I understand, he said, his tone steady, because he did understand, not just the words, but the meaning behind them. Noah looked between them, his expression thoughtful, and then he spoke again. We can still go to the park, he said, and there was a small shift in his tone, something lighter, something that carried the ease of a child who had begun to accept something new without losing what he already had. And Amara glanced at him, then at Ethan, and after a brief moment, she nodded. We can, she said, and they began walking again, the same path as before, but this time, the space between them felt different, not defined by distance, but by connection that had been built slowly, carefully, without force. In the park, as Noah ran ahead again, his laughter carrying through the air, Ethan stood beside Amara for a moment, not speaking immediately, not filling the silence, and after a while, she said quietly, You are still learning, and he nodded. Yes, he replied, and she glanced at him, her gaze steady. Then keep learning, she said, and there was no softness in the words, but there was no resistance either, just truth. And Ethan understood that this was not an ending, not a resolution. It was a continuation, something that would require the same thing every day, showing up, staying present, and proving, not with words, but with time, that he could be someone who did not leave, someone who did not disappear, someone who understood that staying was not just about being there. It was about being worthy of the space he was given. And as Noah ran back toward them, his small figure steady and sure, Ethan felt something settle inside him, not as relief, not as victory, but as direction, clear and unwavering, because for the first time, he knew exactly where he needed to be, and he was finally willing to stay there.